On several occasions, we've had discussions about kinds of poetry. And there's this broad sort of generalization that's academic poetry. And yet, there seems to be this inescapable fact that in America, there's almost very little places where poetry is supported other than the academic world at school and learning, anthologies that are written primarily for students. Can you sort of tell us what academic poetry was and is now, and how do you approach that ground in terms of your students?
Well, that's been a long debate. There was a phrase used at one time, palefaces and Indians, that the palefaces were the academics and the Indians were the ones surrounding the wagons. I think that these are artificial distinctions. What I think is happening in this country is that the audience for poetry seems to be poets, and we've sort of lost some connections with the public. I think the public has been very much involved with the visual and other kinds of media, and they haven't really been that attentive to poetry. So, in a funny way, though poetry is not in any way competitive with novels now or with film, there's a large world of poetry, and it's associated with the little magazines and the journals and the periodicals. Now, in those, there are different types, and you might say that when you look at those types, there are some welcome audiences for some kinds of poetry in one kind of magazine and another kind of poetry in another. I think that what I see in America is an attitude toward poetry in, you might say, the larger magazines and in, I suppose, in the universities that offers the poem as a kind of model. It's like, let me give you an example. A typical New Yorker poem would have something to do with closing the house in Martha's Vineyard for the summer. Before you're heading back to New York. And it would be, the house itself would then be very carefully worked out symbolically and have some sense of termination, some sense of a modeling of associated with nostalgia or death. And these kinds of poems just appear again and again and again.
They all sound like they're written by the same person.
It's as if they were written by the same person, and they appear in a lot of the major sort of wealthier...
Right. Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, there's a whole list of...
That's the kind. And that ideal is a dead ideal. Right. And the kind of living poetry that seems to go on is another kind. Mm-hmm. A poem like that can be a real poem, but it just seems to me formularized. Mm-hmm. Whenever a poem becomes a formula, then I think it dies.
In a very narrow range of interests.
Now, ironically, do you think it's the responsibility of the academic world to change this? To inject some life into, to somehow resurrect this deadness? I mean, is that a part of what you're doing?
Well, I think the academic world fails to do it because they worship the classics too much, and they're over-anthologized. The books contain familiar things that teachers can teach. They're frightened of anything new. If you put a new poem in an anthology the teacher hasn't taught, the anthologizer runs the risk of having that book not adopted. So that the things that are given to students who are not themselves poets but are students of literature, these things are already sort of canned. They've already been taken care of.
Let me ask Jodi, as a student, and you've been studying poetry now for a few years and workshops, etc.
I'm working on my master's now, so I finished my bachelor's at Northridge also.
Okay. Did you go through a progression where you felt, hey, there must be a right way to do this and a wrong way or something, and then gradually feel, hey, it's wide open, I could do whatever I want, or what?
I think that as a student, as Ben was saying, you read a lot of the sort of accepted poets and many dead poets.
Right.
You don't read very many contemporary people who are writing now. And when you start writing, perhaps unconsciously as much as anything, you tend to imitate or draw on the sort of metaphors and images that have been presented to you for years and years. And that's why I think the workshop programs, which they're bringing up now, are very helpful, because you exchange poetry, exchange thoughts with people who are writing now, with people who are learning as you are.
Right.
And that's when you start to really get in touch with what is you in your poetry and with your way of saying things.
Do you think a lot of students are scared away? People might even be good poets if they worked at it by the eminence grise, the great people who held up as great poets, the so-called, because it seems so remote, abstract, etc.
I think it's certainly humbling,
Yeah.
to see what some people have achieved and to think, how am I ever going to do something like that, even in my own way. But you can certainly learn a lot from that too, and I think that yes, you do have to overcome perhaps that
It's
kind
a
of
leap.
right. You're put off at the beginning, but then it becomes inspiring, and
Right.
you think, I have something to work for.
There
something
probably
to
are
achieve.
levels. I always think that there's a level of first having the nerve even to write anything, after everything that's been written, and then once you start writing, having a further nerve to go on and write things that are really personal